Morning, everybody. Crappy Mondays, particularly if you're the Prime Minister. And welcome to the news agenda today with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by my fellow Mirror columnist, Darren Lewis. Morning, Darren.
Morning. You look like you've got a lovely strong cup of coffee, tea.
Tea. We don't have coffee in this house. How dare you? We're not Americans. Now, that's that country's problem is coffee rather than tea. We'll get on that another day. But this is the People's Pay-Per-View. Get into the comments. Ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast, we'll just have to wait and see what bombshell Donald Trump drops on you while you're asleep. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror, which is one of the few newspapers prepared to still campaign for its readers, has launched a fresh one today with a front page splash calling on the government to save local pubs from extinction. Now, Darren, I'm sure you love a pub. All good journalists do their best work in the pub. What's the problems that our pubs are facing exactly?
Yeah, well, this is a Daily Mirror campaign, Susie, that really does affect every city and town in the country because the Great British Pub is disappearing. If you're of a certain age, and you don't need the numbers to confirm the evidence of your own eyes, you'll know that 400 pubs have been demolished or converted to other uses across the UK over 2024. 3,000 pubs are at risk of closure this year, according to the industry expert CGA. And the running costs have been steadily going through the roof. As we all know, COVID's changed the landscape forever. And the independent locals have been hit particularly hard because the figures don't include the fact that hundreds more pubs are left empty. They're waiting for new tenants. So it's devastating. And not just for the local economies and the local jobs, but the research has shown that there's a really big decline in the number of people employed in pubs and bars. In 2022, it was 540,000. And even 2 years ago, it was 474,000. And so it will have dropped even further since then. So it's a really, really important campaign that really does need the support of a national newspaper, a huge media platform, and we're prepared to give it.
Yeah. Now, pubs are facing really a triple whammy, aren't they? They've got higher costs, there's the cost of living, and of course there's societal changes post-COVID, which you mentioned there, all of which means more people are staying at home. And what do you think, everybody watching this? How important are your pubs to you in your community? And not just towns and cities, Darren, villages too. Steve says, I did my bit for my local pub last night. Well done, Steve. But not everybody does, of course. When was the last time you've been in a pub? Is there any of you perhaps you can't remember? Or does it not matter? Are these sort of a relic of the past and they're not really necessary anymore? People don't all stop for a pint on the way home these days. They just, the market just isn't there in the same way that it used to be. I was in a pub with friends on Friday night, Darren, for a birthday meal. And I can tell you now that was A, the first time this year I've been to the pub. In fact, it was the first time since Christmas. And B, we all had only one drink each because it was a village pub and we were driving home. And C, the place was nearly empty on a Friday night. There's probably a couple of dozen people, and it's one of those places that quite sprawls out with different eaty places all over the shop. A few dozen people in there, most of them not drinking very much and driving home. So, what does the Mirror want done about this? What's it asking for?
Well, it's asking for support from the government in terms of conversations to be had, maybe even a fighting fund to be set up to help those pubs that are really struggling with the spiraling costs. Because I think without that support, those clubs really, we can wave goodbye to them without a fight. And Graham Hiscott, who's done a terrific job with this whole thing, he's made a number of observations in this piece, and read it. It's a really good piece because he said, listen, each pub deprives a community of a vital hub. It's not just because my argument would be that there are lots of people whose social habits have changed, but pubs aren't just about the beer and the spiraling costs of beer, which is a part of the reason why people don't go, because of the spiraling costs of alcohol. Excuse me. But they're a meeting place, they're an outpost in the war of loneliness, as he puts it in his piece. And we've talked so often, haven't we, Susie, you and I, about the fear that so many of us are being sucked down the rabbit hole that is social media. Graham's been talking to Emma McClarkin, the chief executive of the British Beer and Pub Association, and her predictions are dire. She's predicting that in 2025, it's going to be even tougher for pubs across the UK, and hundreds of pubs might have to close for good unless they get that support from the government. So a fighting fund is so important. One of the things I remember her saying when I was reading it earlier was that it isn't just down to a lack of popularity that pubs are closing, but it's a shocking cost of doing business, which means they struggle to make a profit. The average pub makes around about 10, 12 pence a pint. It's just frightening to think that an industry that was really at the center of towns, communities, and villages, as you said earlier, it could just go to the wall. And so ministers do really need to step up and help landlords to deal with the spiraling costs that are threatening their future.
Yeah. Now, Steve says young people prefer to go to the gym rather than the pub. What's the matter with them? Things have just changed a bit. We've now got lots of zero alcohol drinks. We've now got lots of drink driving laws. We've now got, people don't go to the pub for a smoke or anything like that. That doesn't get allowed there every morning anymore. Morning, GM and Paul. Hello. Morning, Leslie. It's things have just changed rather a lot. And one of the places that's featured in Graham's piece is Bootle in Merseyside, where there have been lots of pubs which historically had a good market. And there's lots of pubs now that have closed down. And that obviously leads to signs of dereliction and boarded up buildings and stuff, which isn't nice in any community. And some of them have been turned into flats. Some of them are just standing there, not doing anything very much. But one of the things I think the Mirror is calling for is that communities can be given some help to take over their a local pub. Perhaps there are places where there's too many pubs and the market's not there for that anymore, but you could still keep one going that would serve a lot of these functions, that would still find enough support and custom then to tick over and to survive a bit longer. The obvious question, I suppose, is whether the Mirror's campaign, the things that it's asking for community help, for support for community groups taking over the pubs, and maybe a fighting fund for those, where it's the last pub in town kind of thing to keep it going, whether that's going to help. Steve says the pub decline started when men stopped working in factories and having a pint on the way home. We no longer work or produce anything. Where I live in rural areas, Steve, it was because of farm workers in the fields. And we don't have them anymore. And when we do have them, they're migrant communities that tend to live in caravans on the farm. And they certainly don't go down the local pub because they're not made to feel particularly welcome sometimes. Now, Rachel Reeves has made it more expensive to employ people. Vladimir Putin has made it more expensive to keep somewhere warm, and a succession of governments failing to plan has made using the energy more expensive. So it's more expensive to run a pub, and we're all feeling the pinch of things like cost of living and there's other costs. And frankly, it is cheaper to drink at home with your slippers on. Penny says successive governments have taxed the cost of alcohol beyond affordability. It's very sad. There is health effects to drinking too much as well, which is part of the reason they've raised taxes on things, and part of the reason perhaps why people are turning away from booze a bit more. I suppose the question is, Darren, is the Mirror fighting the tide a bit here? If a place like Bootle has too many pubs, if the market's not there anymore, if it's just getting too expensive, then they're going to close, aren't they? And they're going to get turned into houses or shops or flats. Is that so bad? When we have a housing shortage, and perhaps you could have maybe a local business housed in that building that would provide more jobs, do better?
Well, yes, it is, because if you don't have a local economy, and if you don't have meeting places, then you do result in a situation which is quite dire, which is you do have that war and loneliness that's lost, as Graham points out. You do have businesses going to the wall. You do have a loss of jobs. You do have a situation within your community that has almost been surrendered in many cases. And we see governments, successive governments, giving help to all sorts of sectors and finding the money to be able to give help to other sectors. Why would you not give it to a sector that has been thriving for decades in this country? We talk about the loss of so-called British culture. Well, the Great British Pub is very much a staple of our culture. So why would we not support it? I find it remarkable that that two things can't be true. As you've said, and some of our viewers have said, yes, there are other things. Yes, there is the gym. Yes, drinking habits have changed. Yes, people are more healthy because of government campaigns to make them aware of their health. But at the same time, you do want a vibrant, thriving community within which people can go to the pub and avail themselves not just of the chance to meet and but also to be able to have an affordable drink, because yes, the costs are going up, but that's not the fault of the pubs. That's the fault of, as you were pointing out, Vladimir Putin making it even more difficult in terms of energy, COVID, and the legacy of COVID, which has really affected all of our lives, and so many other things. So it is possible, I think, for the government to be able to do what it does in other areas and find the money. At least, at the very least, I would hope, and we would hope as a media platform, that the government would have a dialogue with the industry. Talk to the people who are so deeply affected by this so that they can find a way to try to help the Great British Pub.
Yeah. And, from one struggling industry that perhaps isn't getting the help it should have, we need to move on to another one. And the main story of the day, which is that, it's not the best news, perhaps. It's the big story of the day is that it's been pretty much for the past decade will be whatever Donald Trump said while you were asleep, everybody. And on a trip to Super Bowl last night, he gave interviews to journalists announcing that today, every country exporting steel and aluminium to the US would face 25% tariffs. Now, Britain only sends 10% of its steel to the US, but it is another struggling industry. It is one that repeated governments of all sorts have wanted to look like they are trying to help and save, even though it's much, much smaller than it used to be. It's not good to hear when your steel industry is struggling that a tenth of it is going to suddenly face a massive, quarter of cost tax on it, really. So when he had other things he wanted to do this week, Keir Starmer is now having to consider whether to retaliate, whether to negotiate, or capitulate, frankly, to the Tango Tyrant's latest surprise. Now, Darren, is Keir Starmer going to be able to find a way through this? Do you think? It's very difficult to know. We have got some tariffs apparently ready to go on things like Harley Davidson's and Jim Beam. But I mean, is that really going to be enough?
It's a really good question because I don't think anybody knows the answer to this. What's been a feature of Keir Starmer's position since Donald Trump was inaugurated is the contortions from him and his ministers away from the position that they had previously taken, which wasn't showing too much love towards a man whose pronouncements and behavior didn't elicit too much love, to a position where that's much more conciliatory, because he's had to be in the interests of diplomacy. And so we've had him and all sorts of ministers walking back remarks that they'd made about him previously because they want to be able to maintain good trade relations. But as has been the case in the US and has always been the case, let's not kid ourselves, Donald Trump does what Donald Trump wants. We've seen retaliation from China in terms of its trade policy, and from Mexico as well in terms of the trade policy. Apparently, it's going to have the biggest impact on Canada but then there is no love lost between himself and Trudeau. I think as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, he will want to keep talking and very quietly ask that question, does that include us? Well, I think it does, because I don't think Trump cares. In fact, he's been very open about the fact that he has not that much love for Keir Starmer and any of his ministers, despite the fact that they are trying to appease and de-escalate any kind of bad blood between the two. But Elon Musk is in the background winding him up, and Donald Trump doesn't need that much winding up, it has to be said. I think this is going to be a very, very tricky old time for Sir Keir Starmer.
Yeah, now GM says he needs to have a backbone and stand up against the orange baby. And we had another comment there, which was talking about how Steve says the tariff is applied to all goods imported from countries who export steel and aluminium. So it's not just on the metals themselves. Thank you for correcting me, Steve. But on all goods from countries that send their steel there, because he wants to boost American steel and what they call aluminum.
It's not the first time, during his first term, Susie, Trump put tariffs on, I think there were tariffs of 25% on steel imports and 10% on, I think it was aluminium from Canada, Mexico, and the EU. So it's not the first time he's done it. But this time around, he feels so much more empowered. He is ripping up all sorts of convention and rule books and whatnot. And in the eyes of many people outside, on the outside, America is melting down, but there are lots of people within America who are very much in favor of what he's doing and feel that his America First policy is doing what it said on the tin. But you have to look in the long term at the impact of this and where it leaves the country, where it leaves relations, where it leaves the trade relations, which ultimately could affect the American consumer, who in the short term might be happy, but in the longer term are really going to start to feel the pinch.
Yeah, he got a big welcome at the Super Bowl yesterday. Leslie says, Trump likes playing games, so why didn't we take it seriously and allow it to backfire? And why didn't we rise tariffs on goods and services coming from the US? We have a trade deficit. We take more from them than we send to them. So it would be in our interest. We could probably do that to some extent, Leslie. It's probably one of the things that Starmer is considering. But the other thing that needs bearing in mind is that he's doing all these tariffs via executive order, and it has not passed Congress. It needs to pass Congress. Yeah. And there are lawsuits pending.
Well, one thing
unconstitutional.
The one thing that is in Starmer's favor is that Donald Trump's a little bit like the guy who walks around the race course tipping different horses to different people in the same race. He just says whatever at any given time. And he was saying all of this aboard Air Force One. He didn't specify which nations would be targeted or if there would be any exemptions. So again, I think Starmer will be wanting that dialogue. To be asking that question, because he will hope that the special relationship, quote unquote, will hold in this case. And there has been sort of semblance of rhetoric before where Trump has said that the UK might be exempt from a couple of things. So he'll be clinging to that crumb of comfort, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and that maybe Trump wants to tax the EU rather than us. Who knows? We'll have to find out. But it's not the best news because Starmer already has literally like 99 other problems to deal with. The economy is far from going gangbusters, as we all know. He had to have a reset last week because the message of what the government, the message of what the government is doing is not getting through. And just when he's about to launch this week, a week full of immigration stuff, lots of images and footage is going to be on your news tonight about arresting people, illegal immigrants in nail bars and car washes and so on, just to show how tough he is. There's a whole bunch of Labour councillors and MPs who have been dragged into a WhatsApp scandal, which is in the paper today. Now, Darren, can you take us through this a bit? Because Starmer had to sack a minister over this during the weekend. Now we hear there is a second MP under investigation.
Yeah, I'm writing a column on this for tomorrow's Mirror, and I'm not going to be sparing the horses. It will be online later. But at a time
Thanks for
when
letting me know. I won't cover it then.
no. I think it, because obviously it's a developing story and there is wider context to it as well. So there's every justification in covering it now, because we're at a time when trust in politicians is lower than it's ever been. So look, it's the story of the Labour minister Andrew Gwynn. He was sacked at the weekend after he allegedly made racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic remarks. I'm not calling them jokes because, Susie, this is no laughing matter. He is alleged to have racially insulted his Labour colleague, Diane Abbott. He's alleged to have made a sexist comment about the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, and he's alleged to have made an anti-Jewish slur. Now, since his sacking, he's come out with all of the usual trite garbage about badly misguided comments and how sorry he is and yada, yada, yada. And trust me, the world of politics, it will not miss Andrew Gwynn. It would be a little bit of a stretch to describe him as any kind of political colossus. But what is more serious, and I've got to point this out, Susie, he has no idea of the harm he has caused in the wider context to the Labour Party, to the government. As you've been saying, it's under fire from all sides, from a right-leaning media. Let's not kid ourselves. I was critical myself of Angela Rayner's handling of the decision to demolish Grenfell Tower last week without consulting the families beforehand and having a dialogue. They've been saying it themselves. Unforgivable. But every day I wake up and I'm glad that this government is in power rather than the alternative, the xenophobic, shambolic alternative. And so for Andrew Gwynn to come out and further take a wrecking ball to the trust, to the diminishing trust that we have in our politicians, he has no idea what he's done. The last thing that Starmer needed was an enemy within.
Yeah. And so what we've got here is another MP. This is a chap called Oliver Ryan, who is an MP for Burnley. He's apologised for his remarks as well. He's been part of that group, that WhatsApp group with Andrew Gwynn. And they're obviously that Labour councillors, activists in there. They've been making really unpleasant remarks. And again, we're not going to use the word jokes because although that's ostensibly on the face of it what the purpose of these things were, that they're just not funny, number one. And number two, they're at someone else's expense. So it's really not funny. So what he's doing really at the moment is he's suspending these MPs and investigating them and so on. He can do that. He can look tough by doing that, but they are going to stay on as MPs unless they commit some kind of serious crime or there's a recall petition or both. Steve says at least Starmer's acted quickly. The Tories took about 6 years to do anything about peace blowing.
Yeah.
And we have the same, we know, with Chris Pincher and everything else. And yes, other people were slower. But all it really does long term, I think, Steve and Darren, is it makes his party, it just look less nice. And the whole reason they got elected was they're supposed to be the nice guys. And this, it just goes in there as even if he's been tough on it, it's going, well, yeah, but your party is full of unpleasant people.
It's hypocrisy. You're saying one thing publicly and privately you are saying racist, sexist, anti-Semitic stuff, the kind of stuff that we would hear from other more extreme parties. And it hurts everybody within the government, within the Labour Party, because you just cannot trust what they're saying to us anymore.
Yeah. And you just don't feel like they are what they said on the side of the tin. Never mind the betrayal that various parts of society are going to feel that someone in their government is speaking about perhaps them or their friends in that way. Now, he's also got reform. Keir Starmer has got reform nipping at his ankles, in fact, ahead in some polls, presumably polls that were conducted in asylums where people think Nigel Farage would be a better prime minister. But we hear today that Starmer has plans to go after Nigel on the basis of his apologism for Vladimir Putin, which is a sort of a fairly historic fact and apparently doesn't go down at all well with voters or even reform supporters. And Farage has been very flattering to Putin in the past and said a lot of stuff about Ukraine and everything else that's not really mainstream, should we say. Is taking the fight to Nigel a wise thing to do you think, Darren, especially as considering what some of his party appear to be saying? Or does Keir Starmer risk making Nigel Farage more credible by taking
Yes, he does. I don't know why he does. I think he understands that Farage is weaponizing guy next door, bloke next door image, and he's a raconteur, and he peddles the fear that worries so many people around this country. But the way to out Farage is to do your job, do the things you promised you would do, make life for ordinary people better. I worry about this whole illegal worker raids on bars, car washes, and restaurants in pursuit of so-called illegal immigrants. First of all, they're a hideous stereotype of various sections of our society, which plays absolutely to the kind of Farage base. And second of all, listen, on the way back from the school run before I'm doing this, I listened to people saying, who do Labour think they're kidding? You know, none of the people that he is trying to curry favour with would vote for him over Nigel Farage. Stick to your principles and do the things that people put you in power to do. That's how to out Farage somebody like him, rather than give him the legitimacy that we would rather he not have. He gets enough of that, and I have to be honest, by mainstream platforms who put him on TV, on the radio, when he should not be in the political arena. You can only get rid of someone like that by staying true to your values and delivering what you promised the people you would do. That's why they elected you.
Yeah. So rather than trying to, spike Farage's cannon a bit by doing the things that Farage wants us to talk about, which is kind of the Tory policy, wasn't it? In the last government was trying to do the things that Farage would have wanted them to do, to actually show, no, that Farage is wrong. These are the things that we're going to do. This is what we're about. We're about a national care service. We're about the National Health Service. We're about education. We're about whatever it may be. That is something different and better that proves Nigel Farage is wrong. Paul says Farage believes in free speech until he's asked a hard question based on facts. Absolutely right. We have this sort of strange situation. We're a bit like Donald Trump, I suppose. We have someone who is not, as he was a few years ago, not in power, but is setting the conversation. And as such, appears to be more credible, I suppose, because the things he's talking about then become the thing the government is having to worry about. And then we have these polls going, well, I'd rather see what he would have to do about all this. Never mind that once you go into a general election, the candidates and the policies that Reform come up with are the kind of thing that generally make people go, grey overnight. And they do not show very well at the polls whatsoever. And he's currently, Farage today is out, or it's been overnight, I think, out trying to scoop up some candidates and people to sign up to stand as Reform candidates in the May local elections, because he doesn't have enough people prepared to actually be part of his party, because they so often attract wingnuts and racists.
And this is the guy we're fighting against. This is the guy Starmer is trying to fight against, and yet just by taking his eye off the ball and acknowledging him and giving him that legitimacy, he is undermining his own program. That it's almost as if he's thinking to himself, well, I had this program of manifesto pledges that I wanted to keep to, but he's actually getting a little bit popular with a certain demographic. Therefore, I need to win that demographic. I don't mind if I alienate the demographic that is the traditional Labour base. In pursuit of doing that, I just need to worry about him. It's just a ludicrous strategy which is doomed to failure.
And it may well be that he could, by raiding every nail bar and car wash in the country, that you could find huge numbers of illegal immigrants and deport lots and lots of people. And maybe you can say, well, we've deported X number of people, which is more than anybody else, and we're the toughest. But it's not going to matter a damn if there's still one single boat landing on the Kent coast, because that's the thing people care about, even though it's the tiniest proportion of immigration. It's not the facts or the figures or the truth that people are really worried about. It's how things look, which is why Nigel tends to get a lot of attention, because it looks good on television. He's great on TV. Keir Starmer is not. But of course, one of the things that really makes a big difference is what makes a difference in your life, whether your local pub is boarded up, whether your local hospital is accepting patients, or as a story, as someone I heard over the weekend, that the paramedics came to see them and help them out when they were ill at home. And the paramedic said to them, do you want to go to hospital, or would you rather stay here? And if paramedics are asking you that, then there's a bit of an issue, isn't there? So the big question really, I suppose, is where Keir Starmer is going to be by the end of this week. The economy isn't going to be any better off. Trump You know, he's either got to negotiate and avoid those tariffs somehow, or he's got to start some kind of a trade war with his own party, the discipline in there. That WhatsApp group sounds to me like there's probably going to be a few more suspensions by the end of the week. So the party
That is a time bomb underneath Labour. Trust me.
that's gonna
Labour
get
more
worse.
than
I
they
think
know.
it's guaranteed. The immigration debate, we're going to have lots of images on the news tonight about looking tough. Is that going to make the polls shift? I'm going to say no. I think you probably would too, Darren. And reform is still going to be probably insurgent, aren't they? Do you think? I mean, what would you do if you were Keir Starmer? If you had his ear, Darren, and you could whisper into it, what would you tell him to do this week? Just on these things this week, what do you do?
Well, first of all, you need to act swiftly on the WhatsApp group. You need to re-establish trust in your party. That's a really key thing. Second of all, he's got to abandon this idea of trying to pursue Nigel Farage. The reason why Trump's supporter base is wide and vast is because he does what he says he will do. Sometimes to the detriment of the misguided people of color in the US who felt that they would support him and his policies only to find that he's deporting friends and relatives and people from their own demographic. But he does what he says on the tin. And I think as far as Starmer is concerned, he is in grave danger of not doing that. And in so doing, still not currying favor with the people he wants to appease, but absolutely losing the people who had previously believed in him and his principles. Stick to yours.
Well, that's like the problem was there wasn't very much written on the side of the Keir Starmer tin, was there? It was left intentionally blank, fill in space here. And so once he gets into power, he can sort of shift things about a bit. I think my advice would be that Trump is a bully. And there's only one way to deal with bullies. And the only kind of people they respect is someone who bullies them straight back and stands up to them. So you whack him, as China has done, you whack him with your own trade tariffs.
Yeah,
and go,
Mexico did the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see who goes first, will we? And just start hitting things and preparing to, hit perhaps the kind of products that come out of Republican areas in the US and drastically affect his base. Because that's the kind of thing that Trump's worried about, is his public support. And whether someone stands up to him. And if you stand up to him and do it nicely and well, then he'll respect you a little bit. And I think that's probably the track to go down. We'll have to see which one Keir chooses, won't we? We'll wait to see how things look by the end of the week. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you, and here it is. Now, there can't be much worse than sitting by the side of your child as she dies. But for Sharon Jones, it came with a chance of a new friendship with the woman who received her daughter's liver. Now, Amy was just 24 when she died after an epileptic seizure, and her organ went to a 51-year-old, Sue Bennett, who had a type of liver disease. Now, a year after the transplant, she wrote to the donor's family saying thank you, and they met up and now have become firm friends. Sue rings Sharon on her daughter's birthday and at Christmas. And for Sharon, she says it's nice to know her daughter is sort of still out there doing things, living a life. Now, Sue's disease has unfortunately returned, but she says she's been bought years in which she has seen her children grow up and become adults. And for that, she's always going to be grateful. It's a wonderful story and very touching. I recommend trying to find it and read it. Darren, is this proof, do you think, even in the darkest of times, there is no gift greater than just giving? I suppose.
It really is, particularly at a time when the fear is that we're becoming so much more disconnected from each other. But the spirit of human kindness just kind of shines through this story. And it's a reminder also to think about organ donation as well. Obviously, if religion, the culture allows it, but the lives that you can help, the lives that you can save in doing what we've seen in this story, the impact that you can have is incalculable. So it's a really wonderful story of friendship, kindness, and love.
Yeah, and it's really sweet. And we've got a picture there of Sue, who's running races in honour of transplant donors and so on, where she always gives every medal that she wins to Sharon as a thank you. I think it's a fantastic story. And her daughter, despite being 24, had made her wishes clear about wishing to donate. Although the Mirror did campaign for the law on organ donation to be changed to presumed consent, it is still something families can block, or it is still advisable to make sure that your families know exactly what you want to happen to your organs in the event of your death. So although it's a difficult conversation, it's one that's worth having, right? And families can benefit hugely if they lose a loved one that way. So it's worth thinking about. Thank you, Darren, for taking us through all that. Thank you, Donald Trump, for yet more headlines and columns that we will get to write. If there's anything you think we've missed, get in touch. Email me, askthefox, susie.boniface@mirror.co.uk. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. We will see you again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, everybody, stay safe, take care, tatty bye.